Dear friends, welcome to our theological discussions. And this week it is with Christine Gorman to talk with me about something which was in news recently, and that was those leaks from White House from the security briefing sometime in the summer, where we heard that allegedly, President commented on people escaping from Haiti as all infected with AIDS or HIV. And you are an medical journalist, so
Right.
help me to understand, because it simply does not seem right. First of all, I mentioned that it was alleged,
Yes,
but
the White House has denied that the
yeah,
president
sure,
said
but
that.
it is so out of character.
Well, it's of a piece with
Yeah,
it's let's say it's easy to believe of this
yeah, yeah,
particular
yeah,
president
sure.
because of his anti-immigration,
Mm-hmm.
anti-people of color stance.
Or
But
racism, I
his
would call it. Yeah,
racism.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
let's
Because there was
not put too
another
fine
alleged the comment made about, I think, what were
Nigerian
Nigerians
huts.
living in huts and so on. So, but here we are, primary uh, talking about it, AIDS,
Yeah.
and help me to understand it, because it does not seem right. Clearly, in Haiti, that they cannot be all infected, or even
Right.
if he is talking about those who are escaping from Haiti, even those cannot be 100% infected. So,
Right. So I think there are different ways of talking about this. One is the technical, what is technically true, and then since this is a theological discussion, sort of the deeper fundamental aspects of it. And I think part of the reason you asked me to come was because I was a reporter during the very early days of the AIDS crisis, and really had a lot of exposure to the early days when there was confusion and all kinds of things. And one of the confusing things actually is that the Centers for Disease Control did when they were first talking about high-risk groups was they said that HIV was people who were at high risk were in four groups they called the 4 H's. Let's see if I can remember now. Homosexuals, heroin addicts or IV drug users, hemophiliacs, and then they added Haitians, which the CDC later acknowledged was a mistake because they put an entire country, an entire group.
and what kind of reason? I did a little bit of study of
Right.
that, and Haiti does not seem to have much larger prevalence than many other countries around the world. Probably
Right.
slightly higher than America, but not that much. So,
So it was a lot of things were happening at that time. You have to remember it was the beginning of the epidemic. People didn't quite understand if it was bloodborne or or what, and I think the whole idea of epidemiology is you try to figure out, or when you're trying to understand the origins of a disease, is you try to find out if there is a particular group, and the CDC was very puzzled. This is all the logic, actually what happened by the amount of HIV that they were seeing in Little Haiti, in Miami, and so because they kept talking, they kept talking to people and asking them if they were gay, to Haitian men, and they all said no, 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 they were heterosexual, et cetera, et cetera. And what they later realized is that the question they should have asked was, did they ever have sex with men? Because men having sex with men, Haiti was so poor that there was a lot of sex trade where that was one way that people could make money. Men could make money for their families. And so, yes, they were heterosexual in orientation, but this was a way of making money in a desperately poor situation. And so, so this early confusion turned into a giant prejudice.
So it is really dating back now decades.
To the 80s, to the 1980s, which is interesting because there's a lot of what the president talks about that seems to date to the 1980s. But
do you think that it is the time he remembers?
I'm not a doctor, so I won't go there. But I think besides the technical truth, the objective truth, there is a deeper truth here, which is who is part of the community. And this is something that President Trump has really hit, in his Make America Great Again, and the undercurrent of the United States is for white people. And that has, unfortunately, has been part of our history at different times, but also the sort of the better angels of our nature. We've also had the idea of a melting pot of welcoming people from different parts of the world. And so, that has been a lot of our strength. Out of many, one, e pluribus unum, which interestingly, I was reading the president did not put e pluribus unum on his presidential medal or
coin.
It was coin. Yeah, it was Make America Great Again instead. But so that's the political aspect. But then, since we're in church,
theological aspect.
The theological aspect is
that prejudice against the illness.
That's exactly where I was going. And so we have that example, as you know, from the book of Job, that if you are sick, there's a very strong feeling, and it wasn't just in Job's time, but to this day, that it's your own fault, that you've sinned.
But what about all those famous healings in the New Testament? I would, at least personally and theologically, as an exegete, understand them as actually going against this prejudice, against it, touching the lepers and
the woman who was hemorrhaging.
And having actually including them in that community, or breaching those boundaries set up by different cultural and other prejudices.
And this is something that I've become more aware of since you've been pastor here, Andrew, and I really want to thank you for it, is the idea of, I kind of had an idea of the beloved community, but in your preaching and teaching here over the last several years, you've really expanded for me and made very personal to me the idea of the beloved, the experience, not the idea, the experience of the beloved community. And this was something I went through in the 1980s. We went through in this church with a lot of young men who developed HIV before there were really good treatments, and who died.
That was, thank you very much for your comments, but that was my question, really, because here I came to this church, I inherited its spiritual foundation and upbringing, and that is something I became very painfully aware and was here and there told, but not ever in any substantial depth. And that's what I wanted to ask, about those 80s and early 90s where
so it was difficult. At the time, there were people my own age who were dying. And that was a new experience for a lot of us. For all of us, because, since the era of antibiotics, people in their 20s and 30s just didn't die.
From other clergy here in our church, I heard that there were times when there was hardly a week without a memorial service or funeral.
That's right.
And how exhaustive it was for everyone. And emotionally difficult. And
I think, here again, this is the whole question, the whole issue, once again, of the experience of the beloved community. People came together. It's not, you wouldn't want to have a terrible thing like HIV to force communities to come together. And in fact, it also definitely broke communities apart. But once you realize that, you know, illness is not a barrier to community, and then you expand it to, you know, mental illness. When I first moved to New York, I was a little bit leery of the amount of active mental illness that I saw on the street, for example. And it was people in this faith community who showed me how to embrace and see people with mental illness as part of the beloved community. Now, that doesn't mean, you know, you don't have to be a martyr about it. You don't have to, you know, put yourself in situations where you'll be hurt or anything. You still use your reason and protect yourself, but you're not scared of the other, or you push that edge. And I think this is the thing that we are continuing to do here. I mean, now, with seeing the community, the beloved community, as expanding beyond the congregation to including, you know, our neighbors and others actively supporting the 2 Syrian refugee families that we support.
From the Bible class we are just now engaging in, those theologians we are studying are bringing forward. You mentioned AIDS or mental illness. Many of these illnesses are actually incurable or difficult to cure, but it does not mean that there cannot be healing, and that the healing is more holistic or embraces individuals within the context of community. And that's one way of talking about it, and actually I saw it happening.
And as I know nurses often talk about, because I've interviewed a lot of nurses, they talk about the difference between healing and cure, just to be clear. So a cure is when the disease disappears. A healing is more, in theological terms, coming back to the community or being part of the community, being made whole, not necessarily physically, but spiritually and emotionally, to face whatever, you know, is next.
And reconciled with, you know, say, reconciled with sisters, brothers, parents, if possible, of course, and reconciled with, to some degree, with our whole destiny, which we inevitably are sharing,
right,
as immortal creatures.
Right, and I'll never forget one of the interviews I did in the 1980s was with a man named Archie Harrison. And he lived in the West 50s, and there was just a, he had HIV, he had AIDS, and I was sitting in his living room talking with him, and there was just sometimes when you are interviewing somebody, there's such a connection, and I was in my 20s and you know, it was still this new idea of somebody else in their 20s facing imminent death. And I said to him, well, what do you think about, I mean, how do you feel about the fact that you're dying, you know? And which was, of course, a very rude question to ask. But it was one of those situations where, you know, they talk about thin places. It was one of those contacts, one of those very intimate relationships. And he took it in the way that I asked the question, and he said, well, I know that I'm going to die, he said, and I know that you're going to die. And it was that connection that oh, this is also me working my own mortality, because none of us knows when we're going to die, of course. And and we talked some more, and there was this. I had a sense of hard-won peace that he had found. Not that he wouldn't have, loved to have had decades more to live, but there was that, he had that experience, and he was sharing with me his life while he was still in it, and it's something I will always remember.
It boils down to what is the organizing principle of life. Is it egotism, or is it altruism? And I think that unfortunately many people in the now in the positions of power are seeing it through that perspective or through that optics of selfishness rather than altruism, and that makes
Altruism or cooperation.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't have to be completely altruistic. I don't know. Sometimes I don't know that we're capable of being completely altruistic, but we can be. We can work together. We can collaborate for the greater good.
Yeah. So thank you very much for talking to me and
Yes.
to our audience about this, I think, important issue where just one particular case is showing how we live and relate to one another and to the world. Thank you.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.